King Louis XVI faced a dire economic crisis. The massive budget deficit, exacerbated by the costs of the American War of Independence and internal inefficiencies, pushed France to the brink of bankruptcy. This led Louis to contemplate imposing a tax on the nobility, a decision that faced widespread rejection by the provincial parliaments, especially that of Paris.
Those were comprised of the nobility, right? Of course they would refuse. And calling this estates general after what, 175 years? Sounds like a last-ditch effort if you ask me.
Indeed, but desperate times call for desperate measures. And yes, summoning the Estates General was a significant yet belated acknowledgement of the need for broader consultation and reform. The Estates General was a council of representatives from all social classes, divided into 3 estates. The first 2 were for the clergy and the nobility. The third estate, comprising the common people who were about 97% of the population, saw this as an opportunity to voice their grievances.
So, the common folk finally got a say. But let me guess, those high and mighty nobles and clergy weren't too keen on sharing the pie, right?
Of course, the nobility and clergy, historically privileged, were reluctant to concede power. The third estate's push for more representation and rights. Paris became a hotbed of political discussion, fueled by a thriving print culture. The Palais Royal was a focal point for these discussions. Here, ideas circulated freely, driven by high literacy rates and a diminished royal censorship at the time.
Folks grabbing a bunch of pamphlets in cafes doesn't sound like a recipe for a revolution to me.
There were more like a few hundreds to couple of thousand pamphlets. And then, never underestimate the power of ideas, especially in a society ripe for change. These discussions were instrumental in shaping public opinion and sowing the seeds of revolution. An important figure here is Abbé Sieyès, who published What is the Third Estate? His argument that the Third Estate was a fundamental part of France and deserved rights was groundbreaking. He also criticized the unproductive nobility and advocated for national sovereignty to be vested in the people.
So, this Sieyès fellow was stirring the pot, calling out those nobles for sitting pretty while the common man does all the work.
Indeed, Sieyès' ideas were revolutionary. He articulated the frustrations of the common people and laid the intellectual groundwork for the dramatic events that were to follow.
It's fascinating yet troubling. To think that so many people were struggling while a few enjoyed privileges just by birth. It really makes you appreciate the power of singular voices in changing the course of history.
Well, of course Sieyès wasn't the only one demanding change and rights for the common people, but his words resonated with the French people. The power of a powerful voice, especially in times of turmoil, can indeed be the catalyst for monumental change. As the Estates General convened, the issue of representation came to the forefront. The Third Estate demanded that their representatives be doubled to better reflect their overwhelming percentage of the population. However, the real contention was over the voting system. They wanted a one-man, one-vote system instead of the traditional class-based voting.
Let me guess, those fancy clergy and nobles weren't having any of that. One man, one vote sounds too much like fairness to their ears.
Exactly, Henry. The traditional power structures were resistant to change. The nobility and clergy saw the one-man, one-vote system as a direct threat to their established authority. The Third Estate was burdened by feudal taxes and tithes, while the nobility and clergy enjoyed numerous privileges. The middle class, or the bourgeoisie, demanded equal opportunities in employment and voiced their grievances against the aristocracy's monopoly on lucrative positions.
So, the average Joe was paying through the nose while the bigwigs hogged all the good jobs. Doesn't seem right, does it?
Indeed, it was a system rife with inequality. The common people's frustration was not just about taxes, but about a lack of opportunity and representation. At the opening ceremony, the class distinctions were stark. The king and queen were at the forefront, the clergy and nobility were dressed in splendor, while the Third Estate was relegated to the back, dressed plainly. This visual disparity underscored the existing social divide.
Talk about a slap in the face. Making the folks who represent most of the country sit at the back in their Sunday worst. That's like telling them they don't matter.
Precisely. It was a clear message of where each estate stood in the social hierarchy, reinforcing the Third Estate's determination to challenge the status quo. Finance Minister Necker's speech, filled with technical jargon and lacking clear solutions, only added to the frustration. The king's lackluster appearance and indecisive demeanor did little to inspire confidence.
A 3-hour snooze fest of a speech and a king who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else? Sounds like they were just buying time without a clue what to do next.
Indeed, the leadership's inability to address the crisis effectively was apparent. This only further emboldened the Third Estate to seek change.
It's sad, really. The people needed strong leaders, and all they got were empty words and a distant king. It makes you wonder how things might have been different with better leadership.
Effective leadership could have possibly steered France through this crisis in a less turbulent manner. However, history often unfolds in unexpected ways. Feeling rebuffed by the king and his court, in addition to the representative of the clergy and nobility, the Third Estate, in a bold move, declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the entire French nation. This was a direct challenge to the traditional class divisions and the authority of the king.
So, these commoners just up and decide they're in charge now. I bet King Louis wasn't too happy about that.
Indeed, Henry, it was an unprecedented step. The king and the traditional power structures were certainly taken aback by the audacity of the Third Estate. When the delegates found their meeting hall locked, they feared a royal plot and gathered at a nearby tennis court. There, they took the famous tennis court oath, swearing not to disband until they had established a new constitution for France.
Moving their meeting to a tennis court? Now, that's what I call improvising. And swearing an oath? That's serious business.
Absolutely, Henry. The tennis court oath was a pivotal moment, symbolizing the unity and resolve of the Third Estate. It was a clear sign that they were prepared to defy the king and the old order to bring about change. The king's reaction was one of mixed signals. He initially refused to recognize the National Assembly but later conceded to some of their demands. However, his assembly of troops around Versailles hinted at a more confrontational approach.
So, old Louis is playing both sides, huh? Saying one thing and doing another.
The king's actions reflected uncertainty and perhaps an underestimation of the resolve of the Third Estate. It was a critical miscalculation that escalated tensions. Eventually, under pressure, representatives from the clergy and nobility began joining the National Assembly. This unification was a significant blow to the king's authority and a victory for the Third Estate.
So, now he's got the clergy and some of those fancy nobles turning on him too? Sounds like the king's losing his grip.
Precisely. The growing unity among the estates was a clear sign that the old order was crumbling. The king's attempts to maintain control were increasingly perceived as out of touch with the reality on the ground.
It's incredible how a group of determined individuals can start a movement that even the most powerful can't ignore. It just goes to show, when people stand together, real change is possible.
Indeed, Mary. The National Assembly's formation and the subsequent events were a testament to the power of collective action and the desire for change. As the crisis intensified, with skyrocketing bread prices and growing unrest, the situation reached a boiling point. This culminated in the storming of the Bastille on July 14, a fortress, prison symbolizing royal tyranny. It marked the beginning of the French Revolution.
Storming a prison? Now that's a statement. It's like the common folk were saying, enough is enough.
The Bastille was more than a prison, it was a symbol. Its fall was not just a physical act of rebellion but also a powerful symbol of the breakdown of royal authority and the rise of the people's power. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch us on the next one, because the French Revolution is just getting started.